Kia ora koto katoa. And that's a wrap from us here at the ICA-21 Regional Hub in Aotearoa, hosted by CARE, the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation at Massey University. I want to begin by thanking all of our speakers who gave their time so generously, all of our discussants, and all the participants who were present here, as well as on our online spaces. I also want to thank the ICA team, Mary Beth Oliver, Nosh Contractor, Laura Sawyer, who have been so instrumental in supporting this process of us putting together this hub here in Aotearoa. I want to express my gratitude to the leadership team in the School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing, my colleague, Professor Stephen Croucher, who was here throughout the sessions, as well as our colleagues from Waikato University, Professor Debashish Munshi and Mary Simpson. I want to also thank the CARE team who actually did the essential work of CARE throughout the conference. Richard Torres, who is the person behind the camera really and making sure that we can all be online. Breeze Mehta, whom we have been interacting with throughout this period in terms of setting up the programs, as well as the coordinating and putting up the Zoom links and taking care of the logistics of the hub. And then I want to thank the CARE team of Mabubu Rahman, Pooja Jain, the Christine Ellis, and Francine Whitfield, who really did a bunch of the work of CARE, making sure that all our participants are well fed, that they are made comfortable, and that they are extended the principles of Aroha, love, and Manakitanga here at CARE. So really, it's been exciting a few days for us. We couldn't believe that we could be doing this in the midst of the pandemic. We feel we are actually quite lucky here in Aotearoa to be getting together in a room. And that was one of the key comments raised during the meetings, is that we consider ourselves very lucky to be together in this space, to be sharing face-to-face in these interactions, and then be able to join with our global audiences. I also want to thank our hub partners at the University of Hyderabad, and particularly Devina Sarvate, Usha Raman, Vinod Pavrala, who played a key role in doing a joint hub. And within that context, Professor Sudesh Roy, who enabled us to actually do a hub with Eric. And altogether, we really had a few great days. It was wonderful to begin with the workshops on methodologies of the Global South, and then move into the ICA presentations over these few days. I want to wrap up by highlighting some of the key themes from the conference that really stood out for us here in Aotearoa. And these really connect to many of the Kaupapa Maori principles articulated by Maori for Maori, that offer the basis and the registers for indigenous transformations, and really for leading globally conversations on climate change, ecological crises, agricultural crises, pandemic crises, anchored in principles of indigeneity, which offer us the basis for imagining and materializing decolonization as the process of taking back indigenous land. The first concept that I want to begin with is this notion of CARE as a register for decolonization. Across the many conversations that we have had over the last few days, it has become apparent to us that decolonization is an urgent need. And for that decolonization work to take place, the ethic of care has to be placed at the center of ways of organizing, both in terms of the ways in which we organize our movements, the ways in which we organize our activism, but also fundamentally in terms of how we organize our universities. We referred back to the words of the Maori academic, Leonie Pihama, who says that the work of activism is not just out there, but it is also in here. So for us, then the question is, what does that nature of activism look like in terms of the kinds of transformative registers we need to build within academia? This is particularly relevant within the context of the precarization of academic labor, the increasing forces of neoliberalism in academia have turned to contractual labor, labor that is unprotected, labor without security, that actually does much of the essential work of care, while those of us in positions of power are often insulated from those struggles. Those of us with tenured positions often disconnected from those struggles of precarious workers in the university. So part of that decolonizing work is to center care in thinking through how do we build registers of solidarity? How do we unionize? How do we collectivize on our universities and academic campuses? And particularly, how do we connect across multiple registers of struggle to actually build registers that are caring, to build material practices that offer safeguarding of health, of fundamental access to living wage, of access to security, of access to food and housing. These are basic questions that relate to struggles within the walls of academia. We also want to highlight the ways in which the conversations across the past few days have really brought about the salient point about care inviting us to dismantle the extractive habits that constitute academia. Many of the conversations pointed to the extractive logics of academia and the extractive ways of organizing academic opportunism that critiqued the kind of posturing that often takes place in academia. So, one of the examples we discussed is low-wage migrant workers, for instance, pointing to and articulating the ways in which their bodies that have experienced these massive inequalities and onslaught of unequal policies amidst COVID-19 then become the subjects of performative, shallow intellectualizing and theorizing without really connecting to or contributing in any way significantly to the lives of those workers, to their health and well-being, to the security of their work. So, centering the notion of care is being able to actually see and recognize opportunistic intellectualizing, abstract theorizing that happens at the cost of the bodies of the marginalized. That happens through the production of the kind of distance that profits from these processes of abstraction, and to really then say that to foreground care and to organize epistemology through the logics of care is to fundamentally begin with building solidarity and to really asking what does that work of solidarity look like? What does placing one's body as an academic in the midst of the struggles of precarious workers, in the midst of the struggles of indigenous peoples looks like? So it is in that sense, an invitation to critically interrogate performativity, to critically interrogate intellectualizing and theorizing that is fundamentally disconnected from the actual lived struggles. We also then point to the importance of looking beyond and looking past disconnected methodologies that work to produce disconnection. This process of abstraction itself works through the production of disconnection, which many of the conversations looked at as threads of colonization. That production of disconnection is a colonizing tactic. So how do we then seed connection, build bridges, build an ethic of connecting anchored in logics of care? And then this work of building connections is tied to the notion of praxis, praxis being the actual work of building practical solutions, practical changes, practical transformative politics that are deeply connected to the body and theory, which brings me then to the point of embodiment, that care is fundamentally about thinking through the question of body. Where is the body placed in the work of social justice? Where is the body placed in doing the essential work of caring as a necessity to transforming these hegemonic structures? So this then leads to the next point, which seemed like a powerful register through these conversations, is this notion of turning to struggles for sovereignty. That colonization works through the diffusion of hegemonic forms of co-optation and incorporation into capitalist logics. In this backdrop, then, the recognition of multiple sovereignties and the actual work of building multiple registers for community sovereignties are essential to foregrounding care. To foregrounding rationalities of care. In multiple indigenous and local community contexts, care becomes a way for organizing community sovereignty. So turning to community sovereignty, turning to the power of communities to have a say over decisions that impact their lives also produces then the kinds of rich theorizing that emerge from within struggles, but also theorizing that interrupts and seeks to dismantle the hegemonic structures of communication theory. This then also leads us to this question of structural transformation, this recognition that we are in the midst of deep inequalities. Multiple presentations pointed out the ways in which COVID-19 makes visible the inequalities that we are living amidst. And it also then points out that it is unsustainable to continue to inhabit amidst these inequalities. So from that then comes this question, what is the work of communication in transforming structures, in changing these unequal systems, in changing these political economies that draw from capitalist extraction, that draw from the ongoing exploitation of peoples, that draw from the ongoing colonization of indigenous land? So the work of theorizing ahead of us in terms of how do we think of communication theory is really one of imagining how communication can bring about changes in structures. What is the nature of communication that can transform our politics and our economies? And multiple participants point out many examples of hope, amidst these times of despair. They offer inspiration in terms of community logics of care, community logics of mutuality, relationality, of standing in with each other, of supporting each other. These become pockets of resisting the onslaught of neoliberal capital. So from these registers of community-owned processes, community-based transformative struggles, can we build global registers for transforming hegemonic structures? So the local, in the sense of the lived experiences of the locals and the knowledge that emerges from the local, is also a register for building the regional and the national and the global, building networks and connections that emerge from the local specificity and yet move toward universal logics of care that challenge neoliberalism, that challenge ongoing extractive processes of settler colonialism. So this process of building in, building with the local and the specific, and building across and connecting is the work of movement building. And the notion of movement building then goes from connecting theory to methods, theory to praxis, to connecting with communities, and then to building infrastructures and spaces that connect communities across spaces and across different intergenerational struggles. So multiple participants, especially participants from indigenous and local communities, participants from the global south, pointed to the need for building these platforms. They looked at the CARE Hub, the ICA-21 hub here in Aotearoa, as a platform for South-South solidarity, as an infrastructure for that. And the question for us going forward is going to be, how do we build this momentum? How do we sustain this infrastructure and this platform, and actually continue to build spaces for South-South flows? I want to wrap up with 3 final points. All of this then connects to the notion of building infrastructures for voices. But as Karen Wilkins invited us to think through, these infrastructures of voices have to be connected to opportunities for listening, building anchors to listening within hegemonic structures, and building the basis for dialogues, recognizing that the hegemonic forms of dialogue perpetuate inequalities. How then can logics of care reorganize how we think about dialogue? I also want to turn to, within this context, something that Kokila Anamalai pointed out yesterday, and which was the question of how do we think about the ways in which our relationships can be organized in different registers, particularly when thinking through working with NGOs, working with civil society, working with activists, working with communities, and thinking more fully about our role as academics, and beyond that, to our role as human beings. And often, if you think about the colonizing logics that produce disconnect, the question for us is, how do we reconnect? How do we build these connections that enable us to once again be human, and to foreground the ways in which care can offer us the basis for building other imaginaries? And then finally, I want to come to this notion of the actual necessary work of care. Because the actual work of care is often rendered invisible, this conference offered us ways to actually think through how we can render visible, how we can place at the center the nature of care work, how we can look all the way from transforming our neoliberal economies so that care work is paid, so that care work is protected, safeguarded, recognized, so that care work is collectivized. We had multiple instances of presentations that talked about organizing domestic workers, organizing migrant workers, organizing nurses. And these are all exemplars of the nature of collectivization that can build the basis for protecting care work, but also think through our own roles in performing this care work. So for me, this has created an opportunity to think through, how am I performing care work? What are the limits to the care work that I perform or I don't perform, and how I can reimagine these everyday practices that I engage in to think toward building another world. So once again, I want to thank you all for staying with us and for joining us over the last 7 days, really. It's been great to have these conversations. It's been so energizing for us here. I hope that we can continue these conversations. Many of you have said how important it is to continue these conversations, to continue building these registers. And I'm really looking forward to finding very practical ways of creating infrastructures and spaces so that this becomes a basis for us to actually materialize practices of change. Kia ora.